We're here in Dublin, right next to Dublin Castle, in a museum known as the Chester Beatty. It's home to, among other things, a world-class collection of biblical manuscripts. And in this room, there is a new exhibition of some of those very early fragments of the Bible text, put together by Dr. Jill Unkel. So, Dr. Unkel, would you like to tell us a little bit about this museum and the collector behind the collection?
I would, absolutely. Thank you. So Chester Beatty, the museum, is primarily a collection put together by the individual with the same name, Alfred Chester Beatty. He, very succinctly, I'll try to tell you, was born in America in 1875 to a pretty upper middle class family, went to the Columbia School of Mines, went out west to get a job in the mining industry, and after a little bit of sort of knocking on doors, wound up working for about 2 months as a mucker in a silver mine before being quite quickly turned into the supervisor of that mine. So probably something like a bit of a work placement kind of thing to see if he could, work as a mucker in the kind of hardest part of the job. And then he was able to turn the mine around into something profitable. So long story short, he created sort of a mining consultancy and wound up getting work with lots of different important, people, investors out there. And one of his kind of first major sort of financial coups was his contract working with Guggenheim Mining Exploration Company. So if you're familiar with the name Guggenheim, also big in collecting. And sort of a long story short, really was quite a successful mining consultant, was able to really assess the mines and whether things would be profitable or not. And he turned that really into a very lucrative career. Went out on his own, moved to New York with his wife. He had married in Denver. They had 2 small children and started his own mining consultancy firm. Unfortunately, his first wife died quite suddenly of typhoid fever, and this seems to have been the impetus for them then moving to London, which was kind of more the center of the financial world at the time, especially if he wanted to increase his interest, not just in American West and Mexico, but also in mines in Europe and in Russia and in Africa. And this really kind of snowballed, and he started his own company called Selection Trust. They had interests really all over the globe, and it was sort of that money that allowed him to start collecting. I think like a lot of Americans at the time who were sort of industry, tycoons, collecting is really part of the sort of landscape of someone with that kind of money. I think you collect to, you kind of fulfill this sort of philanthropic and artistic and creative sort of aspect of your personality. And it also allows you to leave a bit of a legacy. So, after many years, he decided that he wanted to kind of keep the collection together rather than donate it to a museum where it would be kind of divvied up between various collections. He moved to Ireland in 1950 because it seemed like a kind of good place to, I think, leave his collection because there wasn't really anything like this here. The collection, as you've noted, includes some really important early biblical texts, but also really important rare Arabic manuscripts, beautifully illuminated Qurans, beautifully illuminated Japanese hand scrolls, and actually quite a lot of other materials. There's quite a broad interest really in manuscripts and book production. So he moved to Ireland in 1950. He bought a house on Aylesbury Road, bought a property on Shrewsbury Road, had a purpose-built library building constructed for housing the collection. It was opened first to researchers, which had always been. He had always sort of really been keen on not just collecting things, but also paying scholars to publish them, to write catalogs. So always kind of not just bringing it to himself, but disseminating what he collected. And then opening it to the public. Fast forward a few years, he died in 1968. The collection was left to the state. The deal was basically the state gets the collection, but the state has to fund it. But because it was on Shrewsbury Road, a sort of a leafy suburb, you didn't get a lot of passing foot traffic. And so they say about 6,000 visitors visited every year. So in the 90s, they were looking for somewhere a bit more central. And this spot here in the clock tower in Dublin Castle was available. They sold the site on Shrewsbury Road and used the money to do conservation work on this building to build the new building, which houses the galleries. And they moved here in 2000, and this is where we've been ever since. And I think visitor numbers have passed 400,000, so we're
Incredible.
way above our 6,000
Incredible.
Shrewsbury Road numbers, yeah.
That is amazing. So what about the importance of his collection of biblical papyri? How did he get into that? And is it really a significant collection for biblical scholarship?
If we're talking about the papyrus collection, absolutely, completely important. So he, I think like a lot of people of his ilk at the time, spent a lot of time in Egypt. Him and his wife, his second wife Edith, bought property and built a house there. And they would spend basically every winter in Egypt, and that's where he would come in contact with dealers who sold lots of things. So Armenian manuscripts, Ethiopian manuscripts, Arabic manuscripts, Qurans, lots of material would come through dealers who were based in Cairo, as well as papyrus collections. And this particular collection, which is known as the Chester Beatty Biblical Papyri, it's 11 manuscripts of various states of preservation. So some of them really well preserved, others you like two fragments really of the book. But that acquisition that was made in 1930 and then 1931 and a little bit more in 1934 really solidified his name as a collector of renown. And there were numerous newspaper articles at the time that really were keen on this because it sort of pushed back scholarship by about 100 years, because the earliest biblical texts at that time were the great parchment codices. So it pushed the dating back about 100 years. The fact that it included a 4-gospel codex about 100 years earlier sort of pushed back the whole idea of when kind of canonization may have started to happen. So immediately things were published. There were facsimiles produced, they were commissioned and produced almost within the first few years of all of the manuscripts from this collection. And they have been the subject of scholarship ever since. So, and it continued to be the subject of scholarship. They've all been completely digitized and they're all online now. And so you can download them if you wish to your will.
Wonderful. I mean, I remember when I was reading through my Greek New Testament when I was studying theology and looking at a list at the end of all the earliest papyri, and you have all these really important libraries, and then Dublin, and just this pride swelled up within me, wow, all this is here on our doorstep. So would you tell us a little bit about this exhibition which you have put together? What was the inspiration behind it?
So, because the collection is really popular, not just to academics, also to Christians who come and look at these as really early artifacts of their religion and their faith. The shop has always been asking after a little book that they could sell that gives you a kind of summary of the collection. So that was kind of the impetus for organizing an exhibition, because then you'd have the exhibition catalog that the idea would be I would design it in such a way that it could live past the exhibition, kind of give you a summary, but also kind of be able to have a shelf life thereafter. So that was the sort of impetus behind it. And then there was plans for the exhibition, and of course COVID pushed everything out, but that just means I had way more time to do research, which is great because normally you don't have that much time to do research for your exhibitions. So it evolved in a really interesting way, and my concern was always, because usually our exhibitions include illuminations, so you have something visual for people to catch on to. And obviously this collection, well, not obviously, but it doesn't have any illuminations. There are a few sort of throughout, but none of the actual manuscripts include illuminations. In fact, they include very little in terms of paratext. So even things like titles and punctuation is sort of not that many.
Yeah.
So my concern was always, obviously there is a core group of people who will be immediately interested in wanting to see the exhibition, but I wanted the exhibition to be for everybody. So you could kind of dip your toe into 3rd century biblical texts.
Brilliant.
So that's how it kind of came to be organized as it is, in terms of looking at the manuscripts through people.
Yeah.
So how they were made. So we're looking at kind of reconstructing the single pages as a book, so how it would have been used. Because obviously now they're sort of out of their original context. They're individually housed in plates of glass, So it gets really hard to really have this idea of them as books that would have been held and used and read. So the idea is trying to kind of reconstruct the materiality in the book as an object, and then sort of the idea of scribes and how they can make mistakes, and how actually that seems quite, I can get that. You know, if I'm transcribing something, I can easily skip a line or easily go back and repeat something.
Before Grammarly was able to check your text.
Exactly. So it's really, it's a way, I think, in. And then on the other side, sort of how the books were used, so how they were read. You know, most people in the 3rd century probably weren't literate. So most people are accessing these texts by hearing them read out loud. And so the fact that there is no punctuation, or very little punctuation, very little spacing, means that, you know, you kind of have to figure out, okay, well, how are they read? How did they know how to read it correctly?
Yes.
So that, you know, putting the correct emphasis on the right part of the sentence is really important.
Yeah.
To the idea of then how the manuscripts were used by early scholars, and how they were interpreted, and how canonization was sort of gradual and over time, and how nothing was sort of set in stone at the beginning. And then collectors, so kind of bringing it all the way back down to how they look today, how they got here, and how collectors and scholars have a huge impact on how things are preserved, as in between these sheets of glass. But can also have an impact on how things are treated. So, you know, conservation was really at an early stage in the 20th century. So there's manuscripts in the collection that maybe were treated with chemicals that we wouldn't use today. There are some, these are pretty good.
Yes.
But there are other papyrus manuscripts collection that have some treatment where they used sellotape, which is not great now, but it was an amazing application, you know, back in the mid 20th century. You know, they didn't know that it would have such bad implications later on. And conservation's kind of come a really long way. Luckily, this collection is in a pretty good nick. It didn't have too much extra invasive conservation or preservation work done to it at the time, because the pages themselves were fairly well preserved and weren't falling apart as much as others were.
Great. Well, you've done such an amazing job at bringing out the human aspects of these fragments, which, as you say, visually don't look all that interesting, but you bring out the stories around them just beautifully. Now, these stories must have an impact on the people who come to the exhibition. What in particular grabs their attention when they come here?
So I think a lot of people are quite interested in, I know now it does require a lot of reading, because you need to read the label to know what's happening, but I've tried to be quite succinct. People are really interested in materiality. I think that's always been quite a keen interest in, you know, conservation is a really popular topic. The collector's part, I think people are really interested in that, particularly at the moment, you know, with how things move from Egypt to Ireland, how it got here, how it was acquired, the antiquities market. And in particular, I think, so possibly other people would have put a different exhibition on, but perhaps unsurprisingly, there is a little bit of a feminine focus to some of the displays because I put it on.
Sure.
So a lot of people have been really interested in the idea that in fact, there's quite a lot of evidence that there were women leaders in the early community that followed Jesus, and even after he died, there were really important women who contributed probably quite heavily financially, but also in the belief of, you know, kind of pre-Christianity and as it developed. And there's evidence in the texts, you know, Paul names quite a lot of really important women, but then of course that sort of gets a bit downplayed later on as kind of Rome becomes a bit more of a financial backer to the religion, and you know, the idea of men and women having their places and women not being in the sort of hierarchy of the leadership, but at the very beginning, and people are really keen. They really like that. They really like that. You know, women were just as involved as men were at the beginning. Absolutely. So, you know a little bit now about the First Fragments exhibition here in the Chester Beatty. It'll be open until September 2023, so you have plenty of time to come here. Here on the Irish Dominicans YouTube channel, we'll be taking you through some of the highlights of this exhibition as we see it, so keep your eyes peeled and watch this space for a little bit more in this exhibition. But if you have
any interest in the ancient world or in the formation of the Bible, and if you're anywhere near Dublin, you've got to get yourself here to the First Fragments exhibition in the Chester Beatty before September 23. It is absolutely well worth it.